studio at Chisenhall Art Play Studios, and I'm going to show you how I make my own paint. So for about 10 years now I've made all of my own paint, from oil paint, so in little pots, to tubes, and watercolour pans. So this is a standard pan, and one of the reasons I got excited about making paint is that I can choose what to scale. So this is a watercolour pan, so when I work big I get to control the scale I work on. It's also really affordable. You can get a lot of pigment, really high quality paint at a much cheaper cost. So it's a really kind of efficient way of working on a big scale. And it's also, I find it really enjoyable, just kind of focusing on colour before I start a painting is a really nice way to work. So I'm going to show you some of the materials. So I like to use a pre-made watercolour binder, and I've got information on the manufacturers, both Kramer and another one make it really good. I'll kind of list those in the description. And Sennelier, that's it. Kramer and Sennelier make a very good watercolour binder, but we can also make it yourself. So this is a gum arabic stone. So it's sap from a tree, the acacia tree, I believe, and it's the main ingredient. You can see kind of colour-wise, it's the main ingredient in this binder. So I've got a video of how you can make your own, or you can be lazy and order it online from the shops. Some pigments. So I'm suggesting that we start with ultramarine blue. It's the colour that I've made in here, and it's a stunning colour, but it's also just a very nice one to work with and ease into making paints. Some paints can be quite tricky, so I've got this fluorescent purple to show you as well. It's really beautiful, it's one of my favourite colours, but this can be a bit tricky. So I'll show you a hack with using alcohol. So I've got some isopropanol here, but actually any alcohol works. So I once had some gin left over from an open studios, and I made some watercolours with gin, which was quite fun. So other things, palette knives. So if you have a few, dig out as many as you can. It's really useful to have quite a few available. And a glass palette like this. So it's just sort of a sheet of glass. It doesn't need to sort of be frosted. A smooth surface is fine. So a sheet of glass like this. If you really can't get hold of that, a plate would work quite well, like an old dinner plate, something that we can use as a palette. It's going to get a bit messy, so wear gloves if you don't like getting your hands messy. When we open up the pigment, some dust will rise up into the air. So if you have any respiratory issues, or if you're any kind of allergies, you can just wear a mask. So masks are advisable if we think this kind of might be an irritant. So that's it, and before each video I'm going to have a list of all the materials that I'm using. So the main one is sort of the watercolour binder and the pigment for the watercolour paints, and linseed oil and pigment. So they each are a very simple set of ingredients, just one binder and one pigment. And I use stand oil, wrong one. I use linseed cold pressed. So cold pressed linseed oil. I've picked up the wrong bottle there. So if you use cold pressed linseed oil, that's going to be the best one to work with. And they're really easy to get. You can get hold of them at most art shops or online. Again, I'm going to send some links of places where I buy them from, and you can get them online. So everything's quite accessible to get hold of. So I hope you enjoy making your paints. So here are all the things I need to make my watercolour binder. So this is gum arabic. You can get it in a fine powder, which makes this a lot quicker, but it's quite easy and it's quite cheap to buy it in the big stone, and I'll show you how you can break it up. Some clove oil, just some plain water, some boiling water, so a kettle, or if you have a double boiler, a sieve and a muslin. If you don't have that, some old tights, or you can probably try and maybe work with some kitchen towel, and a hammer. So this is how we're going to break up the stone. So I will take the gum Arabic stones and I just pop them here in this little plastic container. So either like maybe a food bag that you've got, or some tin foil, or even a tea towel, just something to stop the bits from going away. So if we pop them here into this bag, 2, 3, 4, so it's sort of about six stones. And then what I do is I then sort of just bash it here this way. You don't really use the hammer that way, but this way works. I'm going to do this off screen so that the recording setup doesn't shake about, and I will come back to you with a powdered stone. So we just bang down this way to get it into a powder. Now here we have all ground down, powdered, so that's much easier to use. So I'm going to try and fill this container so I can get my measurements. So here we have, there we go, I've got about 1 of these full pots. So that's now, I know I've got 1 of these, so that gets poured into there. And the ratio is 2 to 1, so 2 lots of water to 1 set of gum Arabic. 1 and 2. And you might have noticed the gum Arabic has some sort of darker bits. You can see in here, you see there's some bits that's a bit darker over here. So there are always going to be some impurities, and because it's from tree sap, there will always be some type of impurities, and that's what the strainer and the muslin cloth are for. So we stir this around for a few minutes. It will start to dissolve, but it won't fully dissolve in cold water. And this is where the kettle comes from. So I'm going to take my boiling water in my old studio kettle, fill this quite close to the top. This is my hack to stop it falling in. If you have a double boiler, that's great. Those are really handy. So I just have these 2 here, just to stop that falling in. And then you'll just want to give it a little stir. Oops. So here, I'm just going to pop this into the boiling water. So it's a bain-marie or a, here, the heat's just going to help dissolve. So be careful not to burn your hand on this. If you have a double boiler, it's a lot easier. And I'm going to keep stirring. This normally takes between 5 and 10 minutes. I'm stirring it. I'm going to leave it just to sit for a little bit. These are my studio hack for things to sit in the double boiler. So it's been about 5 minutes. You can see it's starting. It is quite gloopy now. So it's almost a bit like gelatin the way it dissolves. So that's going to slowly keep dissolving. And give it a stir, and then we wait another 5–10 minutes. So it's almost ready. What I tend to do is sometimes there is a few little bits that don't dissolve. But we can see the thickness here. There's enough of the binder. So, and we have the binder that we've made, our tea strainer, and a little bit of cheesecloth. If you don't have this, some old tights, you can pick up things like that, just something to strain those little brown bits in here. You just want those little bits of the, sort of tap that down, it's starting to sink down. Here we have the binder. And we can then reboil these bits if you want to melt these. But this is more than enough. So can we hear that? So there we go, here we've got this sort of seeping through. We've got this binder now. So it's like a light honey colour. Wait for that to seep through, and then we're going to get our clove oil. So just a tiny bit of this, because otherwise this is going to go off, it'll get mouldy. If you don't have clove oil, you could label this and put it in your fridge and keep it for about a week. There we go, that's enough. So here, I take my clove oil and a pipette, and just just a couple of drops is enough. Stir. And here we have it. This is our watercolour binder. So it's very simple, it just takes a bit of time. So it's about, in total you're looking at sort of 20 minutes to about half an hour, but it's a really cheap way of making watercolour binder. So here I have my setup to make the watercolour pan. So I usually use the bigger palette knife to get the watercolour, the pigment out. So yeah, about kind of half a palette knife like that. I can't give exact measurements because each pigment will require a different amount, and a lot of this is just to do with sight. It's a simple process, but we just have to keep watching the pigment. And then I'm going to take the watercolour binder. So you can either use the pre-made or the gum arabic. And we're going to start with a small amount, and then we just push inwards. So using a smaller palette knife, I just slowly start to mix those two together. And the great thing with the ultramarine is this does blend really softly. It will go in quite nicely. So just slowly, rather than mixing it all together, we can control the consistency by slowly pulling in more and more bits from the outside. So I'm just going to keep pushing this together until it's too thick to move, and then I'm going to add some more watercolour binder. So here I'm going to show you what happens when the pigment doesn't just naturally dissolve into the binder. So I'm starting making my well here with fluorescent violet, which I know is a tricky pigment to use. So once we have our well, I'm going to take my watercolour binder and just pop some in the middle there. Oh, I haven't quite got enough. Let's get a bit more binder in there. And as we start to push these two together, the pigment doesn't dissolve into the binder as it should do. So we try a little bit more and it just stays separate. So the pigment is actually floating on top. They stay separate like oil and water. So we just need to degrease. So I'm using some isopropanol alcohol here. Any other alcohol that you have in the studio will do. And it acts as a degreaser. So we can see immediately now it's starting to dissolve. So a little bit of this is enough, to just a couple of drops, and now the whole thing starts to dissolve. So now we should be able to carry on making the watercolour as we normally would. So I'm going to start by adding some more of the binder. And we shouldn't need to add alcohol at each time, but if we hit any troubles, then we just add some more alcohol and it will continue to bind together. So here I'm just pushing the pigments together, and I'll continue to make the watercolour as I did with the ultramarine blue. So here I have the setup to make oil paint. So I'll start with the pigment, and again make a well in the middle. You need a fair bit more with oil paint because you're also making a larger batch of paint. And I have my linseed cold pressed oil here, and you'll start with a bigger amount, so a full pipette's worth is a good place to start. And a similar process, we're just pushing the pigment in from the outside of the edges of that wall into, and just mix them in together. And the consistency we're aiming for with this is a thicker one, so it's closer to toothpaste. So you don't want it to be able to pour, it needs to be like a thick toothpaste. So now I know the paint is full. The tube has got about 2/3 full. So I'm just going to squeeze the end shut. And you should have some paint squeeze out. So that's where you know that the tube is full, if you get a bit of paint squeezed out at the end. So I'm going to show you how we close it now. This does get a bit messy. So again, yeah, wear gloves if you, if unlike me, yeah, you mind getting messy. So here I'm just using the back of the palette knife, and I'm just really kind of putting a lot of pressure to push the paint out. So I'm going to slowly start pushing the paint in. So slowly kind of push that forward. So now it's filling up the tube, so it's all being pushed into the end. So again, we make sure there's no air bubbles. And then we just fold the ends. So this is basically how I've made the tube of paint. So I fold the ends, and then I'm done now. So here I'm going to show you what to do if you are struggling to fill the tube of paint, or if you just can't get hold of them or don't want to spend the money on it. You can use a little pot like this. I quite like these little takeaway pots that get cleaned up, but any kind of small little container like this would work. So I just scrape the paint into here. This is also an efficient way, so even if you didn't want to use this paint, this wouldn't be a good thing to throw away, so it'd be better to contain it into a little pot. So scrape the paint off the palette, contain it before you throw it away, because you wouldn't want that just to contaminate everything else that's in the rubbish bag. It makes a mess, and then it's not great for the environment either. I'm showing you right now how I would use this as a paint pot afterwards. So I'm scraping all the paint I can off the palette, and once everything's in the pot, I then scrape off the edges. So I scrape off the edges and I make sure it's really flat. So once I've got that flat surface, then I cover that with oil just to make sure that no air can get to it. And then that's a self-contained little pot of oil that will last for a while. So I hope you've enjoyed making paint. You might have made a bit of a mess, and you might have some palettes that you've got after grinding the pigment on there. So the temptation with the watercolour one would be to scrub it with a sponge under a tap, which would be really efficient, but all of this paint then is entering onto our water streams, which I always just feel a bit uncomfortable about. So what I like to do is I get some water and I get a rag, and we can just wash it off. So I'm just using this sponge here, or this cloth, and it's catching, I'm using this and then catching it here. So it takes a little bit longer, but I just feel a little bit more comfortable about washing up this way. And then these rags, once they're dry, they can end up being reused. So it's a really, I find it's a bit more environmentally friendly way of cleaning up in the studio. And with oil paint, some cooking oil in the studio, just dip your brush in there and that cleans it up. You can sort of squeeze the oil paint out really nicely. So yes, those were my cleaning studio hacks, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. you.